Hello. Hopefully this is working. I am going to talk to you today about the 1970s. We spent some time this week really looking at um, what we might consider the conservative backlash against the 1960s. Um, and we're going to continue on in that theme for the rest of the course in thinking about the last decades of the 20th century and even the beginning of the 21st century up until now. But I do want to take some time just to look at some of the events of the 1970s in isolation, as we spend a lot of time looking at the 1960s, and we also spend a great deal of time looking at the 80s and the Reagan Revolution. It's worth our time to really look at the 1970s. So, one of the things to remember is the end of the 1970s is a very tumultuous time in many ways. 1968 has a lot of parallels to 2016. But nonetheless, the Vietnam War was raging halfway across the world and at home. Young men, very much afraid of the draft, were actively campaigning against the war. African American students were linking civil rights at home to issues of war abroad. Um, so in 1968, Nixon is elected president, and part of that, right, is based on this idea of Vietnamization, which meant that he would bring the troops home, American troops, um, and train the South Vietnamese to fight this war themselves. This is something that the U.S. military will do in all subsequent wars, and it hasn't had much effectiveness, and it didn't have much effectiveness then either. So that's Vietnamization, the idea that the U.S. would train the South Vietnamese to fight, and then they could pull U.S. troops out slowly over time, not being defeated and not leaving either. Interestingly, it is under the Nixon administration that we see the beginning of affirmative action. And again, affirmative action is basically the idea that the U.S. government needs to regulate and enforce that civil rights are protected in terms of access to higher education and in other aspects of hiring practices. Um, Ever since affirmative action is implemented, it has been challenged in court, um, and people have tried to find their way around affirmative action policies. Um, just as we will see in the 1970s, just as today there is a media that was actively trying to expose the machinations of the Nixon administration. There were people working in the media just like today who were actively dissenting, trying to question what the Nixon administration was doing. And in the 1970s, these newspapers, including the New York Times and the Washington Post, are going to publish what were known as the Pentagon Papers. And the Pentagon Papers were a collection of classified documents that carefully explain how the U.S. had been bombing its neighbors in order to win the Vietnam War, and that the U.S. had spent a good amount of time bombing Vietnam's neighbor, Cambodia and Laos, in order to win the war. And this was something that Americans had suspected, but this was the proof that the U.S. was bombing a country it was not at countries it was not at war with. So this became an interesting turning point in the anti-war movement. More people are beginning to question the war, but at this point, the war had been going on for nearly 6 years officially, 12 for much longer. But popular support is still there. In 1972, there is an election again, even though there are a number of controversies swirling around the Nixon administration. Um, he wins the election against Eugene McCarthy, the Democrat who was running at the time. Throughout the election, there is a investigation. The president is under investigation for the Watergate scandal, which at the time was considered one of the most egregious acts a president had ever made. And Watergate involves Nixon giving the order for people to break into the Democratic National Committee in order to expose some of their operatives and basically, find leverage against them in the campaign. Nixon tried to cover it up. He tries to fire the attorney general and other members of the Justice Department. His party very much supports him until all of this is forced into the public by the news media. And even then, he still has lots of support among American people. So there are a lot of similarities between Nixon and Watergate and contemporary corruption and scandals within the Trump administration. Um, in 1975, Vietnam is unified, and the U.S. Pulls out its troops. It is clear the U.S. doesn't win Vietnam. The costs of the war are fantastic in terms of Vietnamese life. Millions of people die. The U.S. loses tens of thousands of soldiers in this war, and it was highly disruptive within American society. Um, the aftermath of both Vietnam and the Watergate and scandal and Nixon resigning and ultimately stepping down from office is that there's sort of a national distrust in government. And one of the interesting examples of this are Senate investigations that start to declassify U.S. documents. Many of these related to both World War II as well as the Cold War. And so you start to see some interesting patterns of corruption as well as abuse. One set of papers relate to the FBI and their illegal wiretapping campaign against civil rights activists, including everyone from Martin Luther King to Elijah Muhammad, and the use of dirty tricks in order to infiltrate organizations like the Black Panthers. Another example of the types of information being declassified in these Senate hearings were things like drug experiments within the U.S. military, right? So collectively, when we put all this together, other things start to come out too, including sort of the extent of U.S. nuclear testing and how poorly people were informed and the sort of type of deception that these government agencies were engaged in. Um, these stories are coming out and they are contributing very much to this. Now, keep in mind, right? This is happening in the late 1970s. Reagan runs, as we talked about Tuesday in class, in 1980 as a Republican on the ticket Make America Great, right? So, in many ways, people see him as the antidote to this Nixon era distrust. Anyway, what is also evident in the 1970s is it is a decade very much marked by its economic problems. The economy took a very sharp downturn in the 1970s. There is an oil crisis due to U.S. Involvement in the Middle East, and oil producing countries in the Middle East stop selling to the United States. That's very much a direct result of U.S. involvement in the region, unwanted involvement. Um, there are also issues related to coal. It's very obvious in the early 1970s that coal is a finite resource, that alternative energy sources need to be found. So there is the discussion and really beginning of nuclear energy that is used. Nuclear power plants are built across America, many of them in the U.S. South, but all around. You need a great deal of water to operate them, so they're always going to be located around great large bodies of fresh river water. Um, and yet many people saw this with great fear. Many of the same doctors who were involved in the Manhattan Project, who were involved in the development of this energy, feared the public health effects of living and working by nuclear reactors. At the same time, in the early 1970s, are the first references to climate change, to global warming, to the real environmental impacts of, at this point, 200 years of industrialization. Um, so the environmental movement is really taking shape with organizations like the Sierra Club, Friends of the Earth, as well as much more discussion in public about toxics, chemicals, and obviously the first lawsuits that will also bring some of this information into the public awareness. Um, as I mentioned before, once you have nuclear power plants, you're going to have accidents. And one of the largest accidents happened in 1979 in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, where a reactor leaked contaminants throughout the town. And people, of course, got very sick. The government said no one died, yet that's not exactly a true statement. And people living there experienced some very interesting genetic mutations that they witnessed over the course of this radioactive period. In Love Canal in 1979, that's not a nuclear meltdown, but it was a toxic spill that really started to energize people to learn what local factories were putting in the water and really what chemicals were in their own backyard. And many of these movements are led by women who are getting involved because they are very much fear for their children's health and safety. All right. Another interesting part of this history of the 1970s is the Iranian hostage crisis. In the late 1970s, there is a civil war in Iran, creating the modern Islamic Republic, which is a theocracy. So there's no separation between church and state. The country is ruled by Islam. Because of U.S. involvement in many other things, a group of young students from Iran sort of seized the U.S. Embassy in 1978, taking American hostages in Iran. Now, interestingly enough, they do let some of the hostages go. They let African Americans go. They let people in wheelchairs go. And they really only keep the white men and women, which is an interesting turn of events. Nonetheless, the hostages are kept there for over 400 days. There are a couple of different plans to try to get them out. But Carter really, who was president at the time, really has no great idea as to how to release these political prisoners. And this event has made him look very weak on an international scale. The prisoners are released, but only the day when Reagan is inaugurated and he leaves office. Um, in terms of popular culture, one of the very clear genres that develops and that most people associate with the 70s is disco. And disco as a musical genre had its origins in soul and funk. It also came out of sort of the gay nightclub scene in terms of dancing. And there was this idea that um, the American dance floor became the most democratized or equal place in America. That didn't matter if you were rich or poor, black or white, gay or straight, um, from the suburbs or from the city. Um, Everyone was the same. It was about dancing. So there are these ideas that really are floated around popular culture that really speak to that idea of real equality being found on a dance floor, which is an interesting idea. Um, However, disco, of course, as a music, is very much co-opted and put into the mainstream culture. There are movies about it, and it's one of those things where it not only became representative of a musical style, but a style of clothing, a style of dance, um, and it's a lifestyle, I suppose. As we talked about today, or rather yesterday in class, one of the more um, endearing legacies of the 1970s has been religious fundamentalism that really rebounded with, of course, as we talked about Roe v. Wade, the moral majority, and of course, Jerry Falwell. Um, he very much believed that America had lost its moral center because of the women's movement, because of civil rights, because of gay rights, because of what he claimed was a more permissive culture. And his goal was for Christians to become politically active and to spread this message of an active, informed Christian voter through media. And this is having somewhat of effect. Americans, according to in 1978, 40% claimed to be born again Christians. So there really starts to be a identification, or the beginning of the identification, that Christians and Republicans are the same. That's really when this idea starts to take shape. Now, an example of this gone in a different way was something known as the Jonestown Massacre. And the Jonestown Massacre is an example of religious fundamentalism gone sort of terribly awry. Um, Jim Jones was a Christian evangelical who started a church in Oakland, California in the 1960s, and it was known as the People's Temple. And the church was very much a place that, in a time of segregation, in a time of even overwhelming economic disparity throughout California, that he tried to welcome all. And it was sort of remarkable at the time for its integrated congregations. Um, he was a dynamic preacher. He very much had a very fervent message, and over time, the message became much more apocalyptic, that America was inevitably going to have World War III with the Soviet Union, that the best thing for congregants was really to distance themselves from society and any other non-believers. Um, there were many family members of congregants who tried to get um, local law enforcement involved, but if there were an issue, the congregants said there wasn't a problem, right? So they very much defended him. Um, all this to say that by the 1970s, Jim Jones is going to move his congregation from Oakland to Jonestown, Guyana, which is in South America. And hundreds of people go with him, many of them who either don't tell their families or their families are very concerned about this move, as many of these people have given their homes, their money, and in some cases their labor to the church. So much concern has emerged in California that Congressman Ryan travels down there to visit Jonestown, and American citizens living in this weird um, Christian village. Um, and as he's there, someone slips him a note saying, we're being held here against our will. And he is shot at the airport and killed. And it's in the sort of ensuing aftermath that Jim Jones gets on a speaker and then informs the congregants that America has suffered devastating losses against the Soviet Union in World War III. There are no survivors. Radiation is coming. Time is limited. And they ingest Kool-Aid laced with arsenic. So that's where the phrase drinking the Kool-Aid comes from. And there are some pictures from Jonestown. Now, when we think about, again, Decade as a collective, I think there are a number of different issues that emerge. One is disillusionment in government. The disillusionment many people feel as Americans in their government is not new, and this is something that has sustained the U.S. For most of its history. However, in the Watergate era, and under a sort of cloak of secrecy was lifted, at least momentarily, and people really started to see some of the uncomfortable underbelly of the government. It's also very clear by the 1970s that there were many problems related to integration. In places like Boston, for example, white communities were resisting integration 20 years after Brown v. Board of Education. So the problems of integration were very much linked not only to school and districting and access to transportation, but also expansion of the suburbs, greater white flight out of the cities. And real estate agents promoting white flight as a form of resistance. Americans were looking for answers. Many of them found them in drugs, cults, as well as good old-fashioned religion. Affirmative action policies continued to be challenged. However, there was also a growing understanding that the federal government needed to maintain civil rights legislation and enforce it, because if it didn't, companies would find their way around it. And this, again, will continue to be challenged in affirmative action, continue to be challenged in court. And finally, with the 1980 election, Reagan, again running on the ticket Make America Great, will really put a lot of money into cementing this conservative revolution that we are going to continue to talk about in the next few weeks. Thank you.